You are lying still now. The light has dimmed. Somewhere in the recesses of the Levant, buried beneath centuries of dust, lies a city that once bustled not with the drama of conquests or epic myths, but with the steady rhythms of counting jars, weighing grain, and logging deliveries. This is the city of Ugarit, the discovery of dusty greatness. It wasn't until 1928 that the sleepy coastal village of Ras Shamra in what is now modern Syria gave up its secret. A plow struck something hard, not gold, not bones, but stone. And not just any stone, a carved tablet written in cuneiform in a language not seen before. Archaeologists arrived. Slowly, carefully, layer by layer, they uncovered a city so advanced, so well organized, and yet so astonishingly mundane. Ugarit, it turned out, was not merely a trade city. It was a bureaucracy. And what was left of it wasn't a dramatic tomb or golden idol. It was thousands, literally thousands of clay tablets, receipts, letters, warehouse inventories, vocabulary lists, and shopping notes. The city's scribes wrote on tablets as others might jot on sticky notes. They weren't writing for drama. They were writing for clarity. A script of its own. Ugarit was unique in another way. Its scribes developed one of the earliest known alphabets. Not syllabary like Sumerian, not pictograms like Egyptian. A true alphabet, cuneiform in appearance but more efficient. Just 30 signs. It was revolutionary. But what did they write with this innovation? Not grand philosophy, not epics. They wrote, 1 jar of sesame oil, delivered by Gubaru to the house of Milkatu. 20 measures of barley, withdrawn from storehouse 3. Leather sandals purchased for temple assistant. Trade, not war. Ugarit's strength lay in its connections. Situated between the Hittites to the north and Egypt to the south, the city was a bustling port with goods moving constantly in and out. Timber from the inland forests, tin from the east, olive oil, wine, grain, ivory, and textiles. And each transaction was meticulously recorded. Every caravan that entered the gates was tallied. Every amphora opened was logged. Each ration distributed to palace staff was accounted for. The scribes kept track of salaries paid in barley, wool, or silver. There are even tablets detailing who owed whom a goat. If a servant received a robe, it was written down. If a pot cracked in storage, it was noted. Nothing was too dull to document. Bureaucratic life in a Bronze Age city. The palace complex in Ugarit housed more than royalty. It housed clerks. These men, always men, it seems were trained from youth to press reed styluses into wet clay. They copied and recopied training tablets. One finds many tablets labeled with phrases like exercise tablet or practice lists of words, names of animals, cargo terms, and gods. One scribe's training tablet contains nothing but a list of birds. Another, varieties of sheep. The most telling evidence of daily life comes not from art or monuments, but from these drab inventories. 6 jars of wine to the sailors. 12 linen garments to the priestess. 2 sickles returned from the field, 1 broken. This wasn't history in the heroic sense. This was history in the lived sense. Scribal schools and literacy. Ugarit's scribal schools were central. Literacy was not widespread. Being a scribe was a job, not a privilege. The training was extensive and repetitive. A typical scribe would start young, perhaps age 7 or 8, and begin by learning to shape clay. Then the stylus. Then the signs. Only after years would a student be allowed to copy live transactions. Mistakes were corrected harshly. One tablet contains notes from a teacher scolding a student for laziness. Another shows the same word written over and over again. Goat, goat, goat. If a delivery included 47 sheep and only 46 were noted, that was not just a math error. It was an economic hazard. The Ugaritic lexicon and the shopping list as artifact. Among the most peculiar finds were shopping lists, not poetic metaphorical lists, actual lists. One such tablet found in a storage room reads roughly: 3 measures flour, 1 jar honey, 5 onions, 2 bundles leeks, 1 sack lentils. It sounds like a recipe. It might have been. Or it might have been a priest's temple requisition, a market order for the palace kitchen, or a merchant's ledger. These lists tell us not just what people ate, but what mattered to them, what was rare, what was taxed, what was owed. Ugarit's lexical texts also give us word-for-word translations between Ugaritic, Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hurrian. It's as though scribes were making dictionaries, perhaps for trade, or perhaps for training. Either way, it's clear. The scribes of Ugarit lived in words. Women in the records. Though the scribes were male, women appeared frequently in the records. Some held positions in temples. Others received rations, owned property, or were listed in dowry contracts. One tablet refers to a woman named Taptihu who received monthly allocations of wine and wool. Another lists a woman named Ilibadi as a lender of silver. These weren't queens. These were just women, living, working, owning. What's fascinating is not that these records exist, but how casually they treat these details. No fanfare, just a quiet line on a gray tablet. The unremarkable that became remarkable. Why does this all matter? Because Ugarit, like so many places, was wiped out. Around 1200 BCE, it vanished, likely destroyed in the same series of catastrophes that ended the Hittites, damaged Egypt, and collapsed the Bronze Age. Sea peoples, earthquakes, famine, no one knows exactly. But what endured was not a statue, not a temple. It was the shopping lists, the grain tallies, the vocabulary lists written by sleepy students, the scribbles of a delivery clerk. These things, too boring to destroy, too practical to bother looting, remained. And that's what makes them powerful. An unresolved thought. If Ugarit's greatness lies not in its monuments, but in its minutiae, its receipts, its recipes, its logs, what then might our own civilization leave behind? Will future archaeologists remember our wars or our grocery apps? What does it mean when a civilization is remembered not for its conquests, but for its careful counting of leaks? As you settle in deeper and your breath becomes slower, you drift further into the silence of antiquity. Let us return again to Ugarit, not to its palace kitchens or market stalls this time, but to its temples. For even here, in the realm of gods and rituals, Ugarit's obsession with documentation endured. And even divinity had to be accounted for, measured, weighed, inventoried, and yes, sometimes taxed. The divine bureaucracy. In Ugarit, the temples were not purely spiritual centers. They were economic institutions. The Temple of Baal, the most prominent deity in Ugarit's pantheon, was essentially a business operation complete with land holdings, livestock, servants, scribes, and of course, storage. The priests were managers as much as they were intercessors. Their ledgers tracked temple property with precision. How much barley had been offered? Which animals were dedicated for sacrifice? What tools were used and needed repair? How many temple staff were paid in silver this season? One document reads, "To the Temple of Baal, 3 goats, 6 jars wine, 1 bolt of linen, 1 gold pin." This was not a mythic offering. This was a delivery receipt. It's tempting to think of ancient religion as mystical and arcane, but in Ugarit, it was often logistical. The sacred and the mundane were, it seems, inscribed on the same clay. The festival calendar, a rotating ledger. One of the more remarkable finds in Ugarit was its ritual calendar, a list of annual festivals, sacrifices, and offerings due to each god, laid out like a fiscal planner. Month after month, line after line. Festival of El, 10 sheep, 3 jars oil. Procession of Baal, silver adornments, 1 ox. Feast of Anat, 12 loaves of barley bread. There was little room for spiritual improvisation. Everything was assigned. Every act was itemized. You can imagine the scribes preparing ahead, checking inventory, summoning servants, verifying that enough onions had been stored for the Feast of Dagon. Yes, onions. They were sacred too, at least when properly documented. The warehouse of the gods. The temple warehouse was a sacred place, but also very much a supply closet. Inventories recorded every item inside, and the lists are breathtakingly detailed in their tedium. From one warehouse tablet, 47 measures barley, 33 jars wine, 12 baskets dates, 4 carved ivory combs, 1 damaged amphora, 1 chipped ceremonial bowl noted for repair. Another tablet even lists textile colors stored for ritual robes: red, blue, undyed, and ash gray, slightly faded. One wonders, was there a temple official responsible for noting the exact degree of fatting? Likely yes, and likely he was a scribe. Temple employment and job titles. The people who worked in the temple formed a small economy of their own. Servants, cooks, weavers, carpenters, and guards all appear in the tablets most by name. One record lists daily rations for low-level temple workers. Grain 2 measures, beer 1 jar, salt a pinch, oil small dish. Others, with more status scribes, priests, senior staff received robes and silver as wages. A tablet titled List of Temple Staff is astonishingly mundane. Malkuru gatekeeper, Hani lamplighter, Dudu storehouse assistant, Adad Narari scribe of offerings. There is something profoundly human in this list. These weren't mythic figures. These were people doing shift work, lighting torches, guarding doors, counting jars of incense. Offerings and quality control. Not all offerings were equal, and some records show priests rejecting subpar donations. A tablet reads, 2 jars oil rejected for poor smell, returned to sender. Another notes that a shipment of barley was watered down, and the supplier fined. It's easy to think of the ancient world as primitive, but this shows quality assurance, religious bureaucracy protecting standards. Even Baal, it seems, preferred fresh oil. In this world, the gods were fed, clothed, and served not just with prayer but with logistics. Scribes in the clay archives. Many of the scribes in Ugarit's temple were multilingual. They had to be. Ugarit was a crossroads, and goods flowed in from Hittite, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian territories. There are tablets that mix Ugaritic with Akkadian or with Hurrian. Some scribes kept comparative glossaries. Others copied model contracts between priests and suppliers. One rare tablet is a kind of template, a fill-in-the-blank offering form, like an ancient PDF. In the month, to the god name was given quantity of item, received by priest's name. We don't know how many of these forms were used, but the existence of templates shows something: standardization. Ugarit was not chaotic. It was systematized. Even holy chaos was boxed in by formatting rules. The cost of belief. We often talk about the cost of faith in philosophical or personal terms. In Ugarit, the cost of belief was very literal. The temples had budgets, offerings could be taxed, land could be donated, and those donations required assessment. One text calculates the yield of donated land. Field near the hill of Tupu yields 27 measures of barley annually, 3 measures to priest, remainder for temple granary. There were also tax exemptions for religious lands, records of surplus being redirected to famine relief, and payments to ritual singers. It wasn't just gods being served, it was a whole community, a whole structure. This isn't theology, this is administration. Religion and regional trade. The temples weren't just inward-facing, they were export hubs. Many items given to the gods were then redistributed, sold at market, gifted to foreign dignitaries, or used to pay off debt. Clay receipts show trade routes linking the Temple of Baal to inland cities. One reads, 3 jars honey sent from temple storehouse to city of Cumidi, via caravan of Lugalidri. Another, 8 bronze tools gifted to the envoy of Hatti, per instruction of temple overseer. This intertwining of the sacred and the commercial meant that temples were more than places of prayer. They were hubs of diplomacy, credit, and inventory management. The banality of the sacred. There is something almost humorous in how ordinary these divine records are. A tablet describing the sacrifice of a bull to Baal includes the notation: bull tripped during procession, injury to rear leg. Did this impact the ritual? Was the meat considered tainted? We don't know, but someone wrote it down. Another record from a lesser temple includes a note about a broken harp string during a ceremony. It feels less like mythology, more like a production report. The gods may have thundered, but their servants took notes. The temple collapsed in the quiet aftermath. When Ugarit fell, its temples fell too. Fire and destruction collapsed walls and buried storerooms, but the tablets survived. Clay, unlike parchment, does not burn easily, and so thousands of these religious records remained silent, brittle, but intact. What they tell us is not of miracle or myth, but of stock counts and scheduling. A city's spiritual life laid out in line items. And what they don't tell us, what was never written, is how the people felt. Did the priests sigh with fatigue? Did the scribes grow bored copying offerings day after day? Did anyone pause to reflect on what it meant? They left no diary, only tablets, only numbers. An unresolved point. If the temples of Ugarit were divine in function but bureaucratic in operation, what does that say about the very nature of belief? Is the sacred merely the structured expression of the mundane? Or is it the other way around? Do the most boring details hide the deepest meanings? Settle deeper now. The fire is gone, but the embers still glow in the distance of memory. Ugarit, like so many cities in history, met its end not with a loud proclamation, but with the whimper of disappearing trade routes, crumbling walls, and fire-charred archives. We've seen its ledgers. We've reviewed its receipts. Now we look at the quiet catastrophe that ended it all, less a fall of empires and more a lapse in supply chains. The Bronze Age world system. By the late 13th century BCE, Ugarit was one node in a complex web of Bronze Age civilizations. From Mycenaean Greece to Babylon, from the Hittite heartlands to the Nile, goods and ideas moved with surprising speed and volume. Ugarit thrived in this system. A clay tablet from Ugarit, written in Akkadian, documents a shipment of tin essential for bronze from the east to be exchanged for Cypriot copper. Another lists woolens from Mesopotamia bound for port. This system relied on fragile assumptions: that the roads would remain open, that sea captains would arrive on time, that famines elsewhere would not ripple through distant economies. Ugarit had no standing army of its own. It depended on the protection of the Hittite Empire. It sent tribute to Hattusa. It received messengers and envoys, but it did not prepare for the end. And the end came quietly at first. The letters of panic. One of the most chilling finds from Ugarit was a tablet, still unfinished, written in haste. The enemy ships are approaching the city. Our forces are not sufficient. Help us. It breaks off. We do not know if the scribe dropped the tablet mid-sentence or was interrupted, but it was never fired in a kiln. Instead, it was fired by the fire that destroyed the city, baked in destruction, preserved in panic. Another letter, sent from a nearby vassal kingdom, warns of enemy raids, disorder in trade routes, and missing caravans. These letters suggest a city, blindsided, its clerks still filing inventories, while enemies disembarked on the coast. Destruction Layer 7A. When excavators first unearthed Ugarit, they noticed something peculiar. Beneath a thin, dark layer of ash, nearly all administrative activity simply stopped. This layer, called Destruction Layer 7A, was rich in charcoal, broken pottery, collapsed walls. Underneath it, life. Above it, nothing. What's astonishing is what remained intact. In one archive room, thousands of clay tablets lay on the floor, scattered but not shattered. Some were carbonized, others only blackened. A few were still sitting on shelves. These tablets became an unintentional time capsule. We often think of ruins as stone and art, but here the ruins were administrative. A scribal library, frozen mid-lesson. An inventory list unfinished. A shipment receipt, awaiting confirmation. It's not a dramatic death scene. It's an office that suddenly closed. After the fire, what happened after the destruction is, ironically, murkier than the years before. There's no clear indication that Ugarit was rebuilt in full. Some pottery shards suggest minor resettlement decades later, but no major rebuilding. The palace was never restored. The temples were never reoccupied. And the shopping list stopped. There are no heroic inscriptions, no final declarations from kings, just the absence of paperwork. In the bureaucratic heart of Ugarit, silence became the dominant language. The unimportance of greatness. One of Ugarit's final kings, Amurapi, is known not from grand monuments but from a few anxious letters. In one, he writes to the king of Alatia, likely Cyprus, begging for help. My father and ancestors never dealt with such destruction. The enemy has burned our cities. There is no grain. We are weak. And that is the legacy of a king. Not an edict, not a conquest, a letter of despair. In the archives, there are no heroic victories, only anxious appeals and the final entries of scribes who did not know they were writing history. The lessons of Ugarit's clay. What makes Ugarit remarkable is not that it was lost. Many cities were. It's that it was lost mid-sentence. Because the records survived, we see a civilization in motion before the fall, during the unraveling. It's like walking into a burned-down office and finding the coffee still warm. A scribe had just finished logging the delivery of sesame oil. A temple official had just scheduled the next offering. A cook may have just received his sack of lentils. And then nothing. The last entries are not of gods or heroes. They are not declarations of glory. They are lists. And from those lists, we learn more about this society than from its statues. The power of boredom. We often think of history as shaped by big things, wars, treaties, kings. But Ugarit shows us that history is also made in tiny, boring details. When we learn that someone delivered 8 baskets of onions to the palace kitchens, we're learning about infrastructure, about agriculture, about trade, about diet, about trust. When we read that a temple received a bolt of linen for the festival of El, we're seeing an economy of faith. And when we see that a shipment was rejected for spoilage, we're seeing a world of accountability. In these quiet details, a civilization breathes. The archaeology of administration. Many of the tablets from Ugarit were never meant to last. Some were not even fired in kilns. They were baked accidentally by the fires of destruction. Had the city not burned, most of the records would have dissolved over time. So we owe the Sea Peoples, or whoever sacked Ugarit, an odd debt. Their destruction preserved the very records that tell us who they destroyed. But there's something deeply human about this paradox, that we know so much about a civilization because someone failed to loot a storeroom, because a clerk stored his tablets in neat piles, because someone pressed a stylus into clay with care, because paperwork, the dullest of human inventions, outlasted marble and gold. The end of the list. And so, Ugarit leaves us not with a song, but with a form. Not with a monument, but with a memo. Its greatness was not in conquest, but in counting. Its story is not epic, but it is complete. And in the end, As you drift away, you might ask, if our own civilization were buried tomorrow, what lists would remain? And what would they say about us? Welcome again, traveler of forgotten records. As you rest deeper into stillness, we go farther back before Ugarit, before the alphabet, to a time when writing was newer, heavier, more angular, to the ancient city of Ebla in what is now northwestern Syria, a city that counted everything and left behind tablets that weighed as much as a brick. This is the story of Ebla's tax code. Not the exciting kind of taxation, if there ever was one, but the methodical, obsessive, daily drudgery of Bronze Age bookkeeping. It's not a story of kings and conquests, though those exist. It's a story of sheep, silver, scribes, and dusty law. The library that shouldn't have survived. Ebla was lost to history for nearly 4,000 years. It wasn't rediscovered until the 1970s, when archaeologists unearthed the ruins of a palace. In a side room, they found something astounding. Over 17,000 clay tablets, neatly stored, toppled in orderly piles preserved by the very destruction that ended them. This was no ordinary archive. These were administrative records, palace accounts, and most crucially, fiscal ledgers. Tax codes, trade agreements, marriage dowries, wage lists. While the world forgot Ebla, these tablets remembered everything. What is a tax in 2400 BCE? Taxes in Ebla weren't like today. There was no currency, at least not coins. Wealth was measured in livestock, grain, textiles, and metals like silver and copper. The palace, acting as the city's administrative core, collected these goods from vassals and commoners alike. A typical Eblate tax record might read: from the town of Iritum, 16 sheep, 2 jars of ghee, 4 measures of barley, 1 robe, 3 baskets of salt. The scribes wrote in Sumerian cuneiform, but the underlying language of the people was Eblate, a now extinct Semitic tongue. That linguistic blend alone makes the tablets remarkable, but it's the content that captures us here. Because Ebla's tax system was both painstaking and boring, and that's what makes it so fascinating. Who paid taxes in Ebla? Ebla had a hierarchical economy. The palace ruled, and surrounding towns owed it tribute, often seasonal, based on harvests and flocks. Who paid? Smallholders, town elders, craft guilds, foreign merchants, religious functionaries, even occasionally women of rank recorded by name. One tablet lists dozens of names alongside their offerings. Another refers to a dispute over unpaid tribute, a kind of tax evasion case. Some entries are simple. Cutama, son of Ibitum, gives 1 silver bracelet. Others more cryptic. 10 measures of oil withheld for unknown reason. This bureaucratic tangle is strangely modern. How did they keep track? Each town and individual's taxes were recorded separately. Some scribes specialized in livestock, others in textiles. Some dealt only with silver or spices. One entire tablet contains nothing but variations of sheep. Fat ewe for festival. Thin ram, market value reduced. A lamb, not yet weaned, exempt from levy. Lost sheep, guardian find. Even the death of taxed animals was recorded. Another tablet lists 10 oxen taxed, but notes 1 struck by lightning en route. In these clay notes, we glimpse a world not just of numbers, but of circumstance and consequence. Standardization in the dust. The scribes of Ebla used weights and measures obsessively. There are entire tablets devoted to defining quantities. 1 guru of barley, 1 jin of silver, 10 sila of oil, 1 sar of land. These were not just academic notations, they were legal standards, monitored and enforced by palace officials. One decree even states, let no merchant deliver less than the agreed measure. Let the scales be inspected monthly. This was not a market economy in the modern sense, but it was regulated, and that regulation was deeply inscribed into daily life. The scribes in the clay economy. The scribes, always male and often hereditary, were trained in scribal schools attached to the palace. Their tools were clay, water, and stylus. Their desks, floor mats or stone benches. Their pens, sharpened reeds. It's estimated that at least 300 scribes worked in Ebla's palace system. Many of them are named in the tablets. One even wrote, Tablet of Abdulu, 4th year. Barley accounts for the towns of Hamadu and Bareb. It's a rare moment of authorship. Most scribes did not sign their work. They were invisible in the system they served. But without them, nothing in Ebla functioned. The role of women in the tax records. A surprising aspect of Ebla's economy was the visibility of women, particularly royal and noble women. One queen, Queen Tujanea, appears repeatedly in tax records, overseeing estates and managing temple offerings. She had her own scribes, her own storage accounts. Other women appear as landowners, borrowers, or donors. In one case, a woman is listed as lending 2 silver rings to a merchant, a sign of private finance at work. In another tablet, a woman's textile workshop is taxed based on output, not land, suggesting a kind of proto-industrial oversight. This wasn't a feminist utopia, but it was complicated. Foreign tribute and import logs. Ebla didn't just tax locals. It received tribute from cities like Mari, Nagar, and even towns as far south as Asher. Some tribute was ritual, some was economic. Records list. Gold ornaments from Mari. Exotic wood from the Levantan coast. Lapis lazuli, likely from Afghanistan. Incense and perfumes from the Arabian Peninsula. The scribes tallied each shipment, its origin, quantity, recipient, and occasionally its flaws. One tablet notes, incense vessel cracked, value halved, trader paid remainder in copper. This is international trade with accountability, and all of it, every deal, every correction was preserved in baked earth. What did the taxes pay for? Not surprisingly, taxes funded the palace, but they also went to feeding the royal court, maintaining grain reserves, paying soldiers and guards, building and repairing roads, funding temple rituals. One striking record lists the rationing of beer for laborers. To 12 road workers, 1 jar beer each, 1 bread loaf, 1 dried fig. Another lists payments to scribes in silver, a rare example of monetary compensation in a goods-based economy. The palace was the redistribution center, absorbing wealth and output, then allocating it back as needed. It was the fiscal heart of a society, both simple and staggering in scale. The hidden complexity of simplicity. To modern eyes, a sheep tax may seem primitive, but the systems behind it, valuation, enforcement, record-keeping, logistics, were anything but. The people of Ebla understood balance sheets long before they understood algebra. Their tablets may not include philosophy or poetry, but they reveal something subtler, a society that could organize, regulate, and sustain itself at scale. And like Ugarit after it, Ebla did not fall for lack of intelligence. It fell to history. An unresolved thought. If clay tablets outlast kings, and ledgers tell us more than legends, then what else might we be misreading about history? Is it possible the quiet offices of the past held more power than their thrones? And if so, who really ruled Ebla? You're deeper now in sleep, in time. The sound of sandals scuffing over packed dirt fades beneath layers of bureaucratic ritual. In Ebla, the hum of the palace was not music or chatter, it was the soft press of styluses into clay. Let us return to the grand office of the past, the place where power wasn't shouted, it was stamped, filed, counted. This is where we explore not just the tax collection of Ebla, but what happened after, how the wealth was redistributed, how rules were enforced, and how administration served as control. The palace as an economic machine. The royal palace in Ebla was not simply a residence. It was a machine, an administrative hub that organized the movement of goods, labor, and tribute. We call it a palace, but really it functioned more like a centralized calculator. Every entry and exit of goods, every labor hour assigned, every textile issued was logged. A room designated the Central Archive held thousands of such tablets. One log reads, "From the granary, 1,120 measures of barley, distributed, 740 to bakers, 220 to workers, 160 held for inspection." Another outlines daily rations. 3 loaves per artisan, 2 loaves per guard, 5 loaves per scribe, privileged work, it seems. Even broken tools had to be returned and recorded before replacements could be issued. The redistribution system, nothing wasted. What the palace collected, it did not hoard. The economy of Ebla was redistributive, not profit-driven. This means taxes came in as livestock, grain, oil, wool, and silver, and were then given back out according to status and function. A bronzesmith might receive 2 sheep monthly, 1 bolt of coarse wool, tools on request with audit. A priest might receive wine and incense. A messenger might receive dried meat and sandals. Every item was documented. One tablet carefully lists the wear levels of footwear distributed to palace staff. New sandals to messengers, worn pair returned. This wasn't frugality, this was process, nothing without paperwork. Enforcement, inspectors, audits, and penalties. What kept the system running was more than clay, it was fear of audit. Ebla had inspectors, officials sent out from the palace to review weights, check inventories, and ensure full compliance with the redistribution system. One fragment reads, "Inspector Dubkuru found shortage of 4 measures in storehouse of Ninibidum. Guardian fined 1 silver." Even high-status individuals were not immune. One tablet records a case where a governor's storehouse failed inspection. Missing 1 bronze pot, 3 sheep unaccounted. Royal reprimand issued. Penalties varied. Loss of access to palace goods. Forced restitution. In rare cases, dismissal from position. This was not a legal court, it was a bureaucratic ecology. Compliance meant survival. Internal loans and controlled credit. Ebla's palace also managed loans, but these were not open market transactions. They were issued as part of social control. Records show loans of barley, silver, even livestock too. Farmers before harvest. Guilds before large projects. Distant towns during famine. The loans were interest-bearing, but only in kind. A typical loan tablet might read, 3 measures barley given to Nappy Her, to return 3.5 measures after harvest, overseen by Steward Hasher. Another more severe. Loan of 10 sheep, debtor delayed, required repayment 15 sheep or 2 silver. The palace became both lender and judge. Debt meant obligation, and that meant dependence. Marriage contracts and property transfers. Beyond taxes, Ebla's records also include domestic contracts, many tied to redistribution. Marriage contracts weren't about romance. They were about land, livestock, and service obligations. One standard marriage tablet includes bride's dowry, 2 oxen, 10 wool blankets. Groom's obligation, shared fieldwork, provision of oil. Witnesses. Penalty clause for abandonment. Dowries were taxed, transfers recorded, inheritances tracked with care. Even in the most intimate affairs, the state's stylus hovered near. Temple economics, a parallel ledger. Ebla's temples were not immune to the state. They held separate but monitored accounts. Each temple had its own taxes, its own workers, and its own inventories, but the palace kept copies of their ledgers. For example, Temple of Dagon reports 30 sheep received, 28 sacrificed, 2 returned. Barley stored, 240 measures. The priests had autonomy in ritual, but not in taxation. Temple land was assessed. Temple staff paid in grain and oil. In times of drought, temple stores were requisitioned for civic use by palace decree. This wasn't separation of church and state. It was a hierarchy of ledgers. Foreign policy through accounting. Ebla also used its accounting system for diplomacy. Tribute logs included goods from surrounding cities, and each entry carried political weight. When the city of Nagar sent only half its promised goods, it was noted in multiple ledgers. A reprimand followed. When tribute from Mari included luxury goods, it was matched with gifts in return. One note even includes gift assignments for visiting envoys. From Mari, 1 gold bowl, 1 lapis necklace. To Mari, 2 silver daggers, 1 bolt of purple-dyed wool. Trade was politics, and the tablets meticulous and dull were foreign policy. The flow of people, labor management and work schedules. The Ebla tablets also tracked labor assignments, not just what people were paid, but where they were sent. One tablet lists 47 workers sent to repair a canal. Another lists 10 women sent to spin wool. Names were rarely given, just roles and destinations. But sometimes a person stood out. Kulam carpenter, reassigned from gate maintenance to chariot repair, performance noted as skilled. There were even records of sick days. Worker allow absent 2 days, provision withheld. Even absence had to be recorded. An absence without note could be punished. Layered bureaucracy, the scribal pyramid. At the top of Ebla's bureaucracy were chief scribes, who coordinated the work of hundreds of clerks below them. Each level had access to different documents. Some dealt only with raw entries. Others compiled summaries, adding totals and comparisons, an early form of data analysis. One tablet summarizes sheep flows over 6 months. Received, 2,120. Distributed, 1,840. Losses, 120 noted. Sickness, theft, natural death. Current inventory, 160. Another logs 5 years of temple barley usage. Its final line reads, consumption increase noted. Recommend ration reduction next season. This is policy recommendation in the 24th century BCE. How it could all disappear so fast. Despite the immense record keeping, Ebla disappeared around 2250 BCE, probably destroyed by the expanding Akkadian Empire under Sargon of Akkad or his grandson Naram-Sin. There is no single tablet that marks the end. No warning letter, no military log. Just a sudden drop in record volume and then nothing. The scribes stopped writing. The redistribution halted. The palace fell. The archives were buried. The system that tracked every sheep and every sandal was gone. An unresolved point. If a city can record everything, every bowl of oil, every day of work, how can it still vanish overnight? Does record-keeping preserve a civilization, or merely chronicle its demise? You are far now, not just in distance but in time. The silence surrounding you is familiar, the same silence that once settled over Ebla. The scribes have stopped pressing clay. The counters have stopped counting. But the tablets remain, scattered in ruins, waiting for someone to listen. Let us now examine the end not only of Ebla, but of its system, its scribes, its painstaking tax code. A story not of collapse in glory, but one of meticulous bureaucracy swallowed by fire, conquest, and forgetting. How to bury an economy. The destruction of Ebla around 2250 BCE was swift. Most scholars believe it was the result of military expansion by Naram-Sin, the grandson of Sargon of Akkad. Whether through war or conquest, the palace was burned. In the heart of the palace, the archive rooms collapsed inward. The fire was intense, but it preserved what it destroyed. Tablets that had not yet been baked in a kiln were suddenly fired in open flame. The wooden shelves crumbled, but the clay bricks of knowledge endured. It was not planned, it was not curated, but it was complete an accidental museum of administration. The final entries. Archaeologists, when reconstructing the tablets, noticed something eerie. There were no farewell messages, no marks of panic, just ordinary records. The final tablets include a shipment of wool, a reassignment of workers, a dispute over a silver weight, a notation about damaged grain sacks. Nothing indicates that anyone saw the end coming. No war reports, no troop movements, no withdrawal notices. And that's what makes it profound. For all their diligence, the scribes did not record the one thing that mattered, that they were about to vanish. The clerks who disappeared. We know so much about Ebla's clerks, their wages, their assignments, even their handwriting styles. But we don't know what happened to them. Were they killed during the destruction, taken captive? Did some flee? Were any spared? There are no post-destruction scribal records, no revival, no continuation of the economic system. One moment, ledgers, lists, audits. The next, silence. And yet, it is because of these men, anonymous, methodical, likely exhausted, that we know anything at all about a world otherwise gone. They didn't write to be remembered. They wrote to remember things. What the tablets can't tell us. There's a deep paradox at the heart of Ebla's archive. We have an ocean of data. A sheep counts. A grain yields. Distribution logs. A procurement lists. But we have no stories, no emotion, no reflection, no names of mothers or lullabies or laughter. The tablets record that 12 sheep were delivered, but not what the shepherd said when one refused to move. They list barley rations, but not if the workers were hungry or satisfied. The system was complete but not human. It was a machine, and when it broke, there was no one left to explain it. Echoes in future civilizations. Despite Ebla's destruction, its administrative model echoed through time. Later Mesopotamian cities Mari, Ashur, Babylon would adopt similar redistributive systems, the palace as warehouse, the scribe as engine, the economy as list. Even the Hittites, centuries later, would maintain grain accounts and temple audits that bear structural resemblance to Ebla's logs. And in every instance, the same fragility. Once the scribes stop writing, the system dissolves. You can see the line from Ebla's tablets to the ration logs at Ugarit, to the taxation records in Neo-Assyria, to the bureaucratic minutiae in Ptolemaic Egypt. The clay was passed on even if the names were not. The archaeologist's puzzle. When Paolo Mattei and his team uncovered Ebla in the 1970s, they were stunned by the complexity of the record system. It took decades to even begin translating the tablets. Many remain unread, untranslated, orphaned in museum storage. Each fragment is a window, but one missing its frame. One tablet might list barley to Barak, and another Barak fined for delay. But unless they're pieced together, the story vanishes. And that's how fragile knowledge is, not because it disappears, but because it scatters. Ebla teaches us this. Unless records are connected, they mean nothing. What the clay leaves behind. The clay does not lie. It does not embellish. It does not turn a scribe into a hero, nor a sheep into a symbol. It tells us this: that 10 workers received rations, that a priest received incense, that a temple owed taxes. It does not say why. It does not say how it felt. But maybe that's the value, because in its silence we can hear ourselves. How much of our own world is shaped not by ideas or art, but by tax forms, shipping manifests, ration schedules. In the end, history may be recorded not by the philosophers but by the clerks. Reflections on a system lost. Ebla did not fall because its system was flawed. It fell because all systems are vulnerable to conquest, to weather, to time. The brilliance of Ebla's tax code wasn't in what it taxed, but in how it structured a world. A world where resources were tracked, work was compensated, records were preserved, deviations were noted. That's not glory, but it is civilization. And when that collapsed, something larger was lost, the sense that order could be written in clay. The final ledger. There is no last line in Ebla's archive, no record of the end. No one wrote, "This is the final entry." Instead, there is just absence. The scribe wrote his last line, probably something dull, and then never returned. And that, perhaps, is the most human ending of all. An ending and a question. If civilization is made of ledgers, not legends, what does it mean when our ledgers are digital, fleeting, and soft? Will our databases leave behind echoes? Will anyone, 4,000 years from now, read our spreadsheets? You are now drifting along the Nile. The current is slow, the banks are fertile, the sun is hot but distant. Around you, a civilization moves not with the thunder of war, but with the rhythm of grain, water, and workers. This is Old Kingdom Egypt, the age of pyramids. And here the most important question was not about gods or kings. It was, who baked the bread, and who got to eat it. The land of bureaucrats and bakers. Ancient Egypt is known for its monuments, its pharaohs, and its gods, but what truly held it together, especially during the Old Kingdom, was a system of rationing. Not money, not wages, rations. Bread and beer were not merely food. They were currency, they were pay, they were the system. Scribes recorded every grain of barley, every jar of beer, every basket of emmer wheat, and every worker's ration down to the half loaf. One clay seal reads, "To the boatman, 4 loaves, 2 jars beer, approved by Nakhet." And with that humble transaction, the machinery of Egypt turned. Who was fed and why? The workforce of Egypt was vast and varied. Farmers, yes, but also weavers, potters, boatmen, carpenters, temple servants, guards, scribes, and most iconically, pyramid workers. They weren't slaves. They were state laborers, often on seasonal conscription from across the land. What did they work for? Not coins, not land. They worked for 5 loaves of bread a day, 4 jugs of beer, occasional meat or fish, and rest during feast days. These rations weren't casual meals. They were calculated, monitored, and logged into stone and papyrus. Egypt's scribes, as always, were watching. The scribe's hand and the worker's stomach. One of the most telling artifacts from the Old Kingdom isn't a statue, it's a payroll list. From a site near Giza, a limestone fragment reads, "Name job bread ration beer ration. Meru stonecutter 5 loaves 2 jugs. Harkuf transporter 4 loaves 2 jugs. Jetty water carrier 3 loaves 1 jug. Unknown illegible, laborer 2 loaves 1 jug." This is not myth, this is administration. Scribes tracked absences. If a worker missed a day, the rations were docked. If they broke a tool, it was noted. If they worked extra, they might receive a bonus, perhaps a slice of meat. Everything was measured in loaves. Bread as currency. The Old Kingdom did not have a formal coinage system. Value was in kind. A cow might be worth 300 loaves, a cloak might cost 100, a bronze tool 50. Even offerings to the gods were paid in bread. Temples consumed thousands of loaves per day, not because the gods ate, but because the temple staff did. One record from the Temple of Ptah in Memphis details 500 loaves daily for priests, 120 loaves for doorkeepers, 60 loaves for lamp lighters. 30 loaves for singers, 10 loaves for quiet servants, meaning unclear. It's bureaucracy, but with yeast. The bread factories of the Nile. Feeding Egypt was no easy task. Grain had to be grown, harvested, stored, milled, and baked. Most of the work was done in state-controlled granaries and bakeries. Excavations at Giza and Saqqara show entire bread-baking complexes. Rows of ovens, clay molds for flatbreads, storage pits for flour, basins for mixing dough. At peak times, hundreds of loaves per day were produced, often coarse and gritty, made from emmer wheat and containing bits of husk, sand, and sometimes pebbles. Dental wear in mummies shows the cost of a lifetime of chewing. But it was food, and more importantly, it was compliance. If you got your bread, you worked. The granaries, pillars of civilization. The backbone of all this was Egypt's vast network of granaries. These weren't just buildings. They were strategic repositories, carefully managed by officials. Each harvest was measured, taxed, and divided. Scribes recorded how much each village contributed, how much was stored, how much was redistributed, what was lost to rot, theft, or rats. A well-preserved wall inscription from the tomb of Tahotep, a high-ranking official, shows clerks tallying jars of grain while supervisors watch. The inscription reads, "Let no measure be without its count, let no basket pass unweighed." To Egypt, grain was power. Taxation in kind. The Old Kingdom taxed not in money, but in goods. Every village was expected to contribute. A grain, a livestock, a linens, a beer, a laborers. Tax was based on land area and yield. Scribes visited farms after harvest, measured the fields, and extracted a set percentage, often up to 1/3. One papyrus from the 5th dynasty shows the tax record of a farmer named Hapu. Field 3 arari approx. 2 acres. Yield 600 measures. Tax 200 measures, stored at Memphis granary. It's unclear how willingly Hapu gave it, but the record survives. He does not. When the bread runs low. Famine was a constant threat. When the Nile failed to flood sufficiently, harvests dropped. When that happened, so did rations. Records show grain devaluation, where workers were paid less for the same labor. A rare inscription during the reign of Jedker Icy notes. Barley shrank, the people murmured, rations adjusted. We don't know what murmured meant. Was it protest, despair? Another document from a southern province reads, "No bread today, water only, return to the fields tomorrow." Even in the land of pyramids, hunger made its mark in the margins. Beer and the calories of control. Alongside bread, beer was essential. Thick, porridge-like, and high in calories, it provided sustenance and morale. State workers received daily beer rations, often in proportion to their labor. One tomb painting shows workers cheering as beer jars are distributed. The caption reads, "They rejoice, for the jars of Happy are full." Happy was the god of the Nile, and beer was seen as a gift of fertility. But behind the joy was a calculation. A ration of beer wasn't just nourishment, it was a management tool. And somewhere, a scribe was making a note. Batch 223, sour taste, check barley source. The pyramid of paperwork. What allowed Egypt to sustain its massive labor force and build monuments was not just stone, it was paperwork. Or more precisely, papyrus work. The House of Life, the scribal office attached to each major city, trained officials to maintain rations, taxes, inventories, and festival provisions. They wrote on limestone flakes, ostraca, on wooden tablets, on papyrus scrolls, sometimes directly onto walls. The paperwork was redundant, overlapping, and tedious. But it worked. Thousands were fed, thousands worked, the pyramids rose. and the records survived at least some of them. An unresolved thought. If bread was power, and beer was management, and scribes held the ledgers, then where truly was the throne of Egypt? Was it in the king's golden chamber? Or was it in a back room, where a clerk calculated who got fed and who went hungry? You drift now through granaries made of mud brick and silence. The air smells of old grain. Rats skitter somewhere beyond the papyrus curtains. Outside, the Nile rises or falls, but inside, the record remains. Egypt endures because the bread is counted, always counted. In this section, we go deeper not into the lives of the kings, but into the process of feeding a nation, one ledger entry at a time. The scribe, master of measurement. In Old Kingdom Egypt, the most powerful tool was not a sword or scepter, it was the reed pen. Scribes were the keepers of order. They measured, recorded, allocated, verified. They sat cross-legged in small stone rooms, tallying daily deliveries. And their legacy is found not in monuments, but in quiet inscriptions scratched onto flakes of limestone. One such inscription, found near a workers' village at Deir el-Medina, reads, Day 12, month of Parent, received 8 sacks grain, distributed 5 to bakery, 2 to workers, 1 to brewer, shortfall of 1 sack noted, investigation pending. Shortfall investigation. This wasn't just math, it was accountability. And if a scribe made a mistake, the consequences could be severe. Training the paperwork army. Scribes didn't appear overnight. They were trained from boyhood in the house of life, the temple school system that taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and most critically procedure. Training exercises included copying official decrees, practicing lists of grain measurements, memorizing tax formulas, learning standardized phraseology. One scribe's exercise tablet lists a mock calculation. 100 sacks grain received, 20 spoiled, 10 distributed, how many remain? This wasn't just pedagogy, it was preparation for keeping Egypt functional. To be a scribe was to be a cog in the state machine, a respected cog, but a cog all the same. The grain storage network. Egypt's economy flowed through granaries' mud brick structures with sloped floors, small entry windows, and interior ramps for circulation. Each province maintained its own storage, often near temples or administrative centers. The granary system included measurers who verified quantities, porters who delivered sacks, guards who protected against theft, inspectors who made surprise visits. In one record, an inspector named Mimhat accuses a granary manager of false recording of 3 sacks. The verdict: removal from post, restitution required. Granaries were not just storage, they were trust vaults. Their contents could feed armies, fund construction, or avert famine. Bread production at scale. The bakery was as bureaucratic as the storage rooms. A preserved wall painting from the tomb of Tai in Saqqara shows a production line of bread. Women grinding grain with saddle querns, kneading dough in deep bowls, baking in conical clay molds, stacked in heated pits, packing loaves into baskets for distribution. Scribes were always nearby, logging production rates. One tablet reads, Day 3, 432 loaves produced, 17 discarded as burnt, 30 set aside for festival, 385 issued. Another from a funerary bakery tracks bread for offerings to the deceased, because the dead, too, had rations. Even in death, bureaucracy followed. Standard rationing systems. Egypt's state was built on predictable outputs. A mason got X, a boatman got Y, a supervisor got more. Common daily rations for one adult male worker. Bread 4-5 loaves. Beer 2 jugs, tilde 2 liters each. Supplementary items occasionally. Onions, garlic, dried fish. Rations could be adjusted based on productivity. Project deadlines, national holidays, religious festivals. A special note from the time of Pepi reads, "Let rations be doubled during the festival of the valley." So yes, bonuses existed, paid in carbs. Crisis and corruption. Not everything worked smoothly. In several texts, we find complaint scribes accusing one another of skimming rations, underreporting harvests, or miscalculating distributions. One tablet accuses a bakery scribe of recording phantom workers to increase flour allocations. Another suggests that beer was watered down before distribution. These were not just workplace squabbles. They represented systemic risk. A corrupt scribe could starve a village or shortchange a royal building project. Hence frequent audits, surprise inspections, cross-checks between temple and palace records, and always a fear of missing loaves. The workers' villages. Excavations of workers' towns, especially near Giza and Lahan, show settlements arranged around baking centers, granaries, and administrative offices. At Giza, the workers' complex included a central mess hall, a brewing station, bread storage pits, quarters for scribes with papyri caches. These were not slave pens. They were planned communities managed through careful allocation. Even the latrine schedules were recorded in one case. And nearby, archaeologists found thousands of bread molds, broken and discarded evidence of years of daily production. Every loaf had a purpose, and every purpose had a ledger. The temple as a parallel system. Temples were not just religious centers, they were bread factories in their own right. Temple granaries received state grain, temple bakeries paid their own staff, and their scribes tracked everything with the same fervor as the palace. A record from the Temple of Ra in Heliopolis includes 800 loaves daily for the priesthood, 90 for musicians, 50 for cleaners, 30 for gatekeepers, 10 for offerings symbolic. Temples stored surpluses. In times of state shortage, the pharaoh could requisition temple grain but only with formal decree. The gods shared, but only if the paperwork was in order. Sacrifice by ration. Egyptians believed that life was sustained through balance math. That balance extended to food, labor, and state control. When famine hit, rations were rebalanced. Nobles kept their portions. Laborers saw reductions. Children received symbolic loaves. A heartbreaking inscription from a provincial village records. Today, only one loaf for the household. The child cries, "May happy rise again." Even then, a scribe made a note, because suffering too had to be filed. The administrative pyramid. We often focus on the physical pyramids, but behind every stone was a pyramid of people. Farmers growing grain, bakers preparing food, porters hauling supplies, scribes logging it all, overseers checking the scribes, royal officials signing off. And at the top, the pharaoh fed, clothed, and entombed by thousands of quiet calculations. The Great Pyramid is 2.3 million blocks of stone. But behind each one is a loaf of bread, tracked by someone who probably never saw the king. An unresolved point. If Egypt lasted 3,000 years on rations and records, not gold and gods, then what is the real foundation of civilization? Is it the monument or the margin note? Now you rest beneath stone ceilings where bread once passed from hand to hand like clockwork. For centuries, Egypt's system held. Grain flowed from field to silo to table. Workers toiled, priests chanted, scribes recorded. But what happens when the grain stops flowing? When the Nile recedes? When the paperwork, so careful for so long, starts to fail? In this final section, we explore the breakdown of bread, bureaucracy, and the illusion of permanence. The end of the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom's final dynasties, particularly the Sixth Dynasty under Pepi II, saw a slow decline, not through conquest or fire, but through something quieter: disintegration. The central bureaucracy that had once managed rations across hundreds of miles began to fragment. Records show increasing regional autonomy. Local officials issued rations without oversight. Temples stopped reporting inventory. Provincial scribes began using differing measurement systems. And then, perhaps most alarmingly, the Nile changed. When the river failed, Egypt depended absolutely on the annual Nile inundation. When it was high, crops flourished. When it was low, disaster. In the final centuries of the Old Kingdom, c. 2200 BCE, geological and written evidence suggest multiple low floods in a row. With each year of poor harvest, granaries emptied, rations shrank, bread grew coarse and sparse, beer production slowed. One inscription from a provincial noble's tomb reads, "The barley was thin, the ovens grew cold, the workers turned away." Another, less poetic but more terrifying, "The hungry came, there was no bread." The breakdown of redistribution. Without central grain reserves, rationing systems collapsed. Temples hoarded food for their own staff. Local elites built personal stockpiles. Many workers stopped showing up for duty not out of rebellion, but starvation. A scribal record from the Fayum region notes, 20 laborers summoned, 4 appeared, others claimed hunger, unable to proceed. The system that once ran like clockwork with redundant ledgers, standardized weights, and daily lists simply stopped functioning. The loaves that once built pyramids were now missing from the ovens. Scribes without grain. The scribes themselves, long untouchable, began to feel the strain. One incomplete papyrus, water-damaged and barely legible, includes, "No grain for ink, no meal for writing, we sit waiting." Did it mean that rations were cut even for scribes, or that the scribes themselves could no longer justify their jobs? Another fragment reads, "Let the tablet wait, the baker does not come." A chilling phrase, because when the baker doesn't come, the whole state wobbles. Rise of the local lords. With the collapse of the central redistribution system, local power surged. Nomarchs' regional governors began controlling their own rations. In some tombs, inscriptions proclaim, "I fed the people when the king did not." These were acts of both generosity and rebellion. The bureaucracy, once centralized and uniform, became fractured and competitive. Some regions may have thrived, others starved. There is no universal record of the collapse, only scattered tomb boasts, disrupted records, and villages where scribal hands went silent. The people and the price. Archaeological evidence from Old Kingdom cemeteries shows signs of malnutrition during the final centuries. Thinner bones, worn teeth, shorter statures, increased child mortality. Bread molds become rarer in excavation layers from this period. Beer jars diminish in size and number. One anonymous ostracon, a shard with scribbling, may summarize it best. "We ate once, now we chew dreams." Whether real or poetic, the phrase lingers, because when bread is the only currency, famine is bankruptcy. The legacy of ledgers. Despite the collapse, the scribal tradition endured. Even during the first intermediate period, when Egypt fragmented politically, scribes kept writing. In some tombs, we find partial payrolls half-finished or hastily scratched, implying an effort to preserve what was lost. Temple records became more sacred. Local officials issued their own ledgers, and as the Middle Kingdom eventually arose, it rebuilt its state on the memory of rations. The new kings reorganized grain reserves, standardized bread molds, re-established festivals, and copied Old Kingdom practices. Egypt learned that if it wanted to last, the bread must be counted again. Reflections in ruins. Today, when we look at the pyramids, we see mystery and grandeur. But beneath each stone is a loaf of bread, a jug of beer, a scribe's line on papyrus, a granary record in faded ink. These were not mythic labors. They were rationed efforts, fueled by systems as dry and dull as office memos. That is the paradox of Egypt, the most awe-inspiring monuments on earth, built by paperwork. An ending and a question. If a loaf of bread could build a pyramid, and its absence bring down a kingdom, what then is the true measure of power? Is it the throne or the oven? Sleep now carries you eastward into the heart of the first true empire, Persia. It is vast, quiet, dotted with outposts and watchtowers. From the mountains of Anatolia to the shores of the Indus, 1,000 paths stretch across a continent. But they are not just for soldiers or merchants. They are for messages. This is the story of the Angarium, the royal courier system of the Achaemenid Empire, the unsung postmen who connected a world. They left no songs, no memoirs, only efficiency, and perhaps the first whisper of logistics as an empire's spine. A message across an empire. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great and expanded by Darius I, was the largest the world had ever seen. It spanned more than 5 million square kilometers, from modern-day Greece to India. How did it function? Not just with armies, not with fear, but with information. Darius understood that rule meant communication. Orders had to travel, reports had to return, messages had to flow faster than rebellion. So he built something unprecedented, a royal road, and on that road he placed postmen. The royal road, a path paved in dust. The most famous of these roads stretched from Sardis, in western Anatolia, to Susa in Elam, the Persian heartland, a distance of over 2,700 kilometers. It wasn't a road in the modern sense, no cobblestones, no pavement. It was a route marked and maintained with regular stations. According to Herodotus, messages could travel this entire distance in 7 to 9 days. Hell, relay riders, post stations, tireless organization. At each station, a fresh horse and rider waited. As one arrived, the message was handed off, like a baton, like breath. The postmen themselves, the Angarium riders, were not soldiers. They were not nobles. They were not even well remembered. But they were trained to ride fast, to read coded dispatches, to endure weather, terrain, and isolation. They wore simple garb, carried insignias of the king, and had one rule: do not stop. Herodotus writes, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course with all speed." Centuries later, this quote would be carved into the New York City post office. Few realize it was written for Persians. The stations, silent hubs of power. Every 20 to 30 kilometers, a post station stood called a chaparkhane in later Persian. At each, fresh horses waited. Food and water were stocked. Records were logged. Riders rested briefly. These were not inns, not marketplaces. They were bureaucratic nodes operating continuously. The rider might arrive at dusk, exchange his dispatch, mount again, and disappear before the station master even asked his name. Records show that some stations also stored backups of messages, in case the primary was lost. Redundancy, precision, before GPS, before telegraphs. Messages worth moving. What did the riders carry? Military orders, tax collection schedules, census reports, grain yield estimates, trade permissions, royal decrees. The messages were often written on parchment, leather, papyrus imported from Egypt, sometimes clay if weight permitted. Each dispatch was sealed with the king's cylinder seal, rolled across the clay or wax. No one dared open it unauthorized. The system wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And in an empire this size, working was everything. The quiet technology of speed. We often speak of ancient engineering as pyramids or aqueducts, but this was engineering of time. By the time of Darius, it's believed that the full message relay system included 111 post stations, dozens of regional subnetworks, seasonal adjustments for weather, dedicated maintenance crews. When one station ran low on feed or water, supply riders were dispatched. Their job, keep the message road alive. This was a living infrastructure, not built of stone but of schedule. A bureaucracy behind every ride. Behind each rider was a clerk. Station records were kept on clay or leather tags. Time of arrival, condition of horse, identity of next rider, nature of message, classified or routine. In one unearthed tag fragment from Persepolis, a scribal note reads, "Message for Babylon, left station 72 at dusk, rider fatigued, replacement summoned." Even the fatigue of the courier was logged, because the message mattered more than the man. Who controlled the flow? The king's eye, a term used for the royal inspector or overseer, was often the final recipient of many messages. He compiled intelligence from the corners of the empire. Revolts, trade surpluses, border movements, tax compliance. This information was then relayed to Darius, and later, Xerxes, who could act swiftly based on it. This was surveillance, but not with cameras. With paperwork and hooves. Non-royal use of the roads. Ordinary citizens could not use the royal post. It was for official use only. However, records show that merchants, local governors, and temple officials maintained their own smaller courier systems, less formal, less swift. Some even bribed station masters to send messages on the royal line, an act punishable by fine or imprisonment. In one Persepolitan record, a governor writes, "My messenger was denied a horse. The postmaster fears the king." Fear kept the line clean, and that cleanliness kept the empire moving. A system beyond memory. We don't know the names of the riders. Not one. No poems were written for them. No graves marked their deeds. No monuments show a man atop a horse clutching a scroll in winter. And yet, without them, taxes would not arrive. Armies would not mobilize. Cities would not coordinate. Laws would not be obeyed. They were forgotten, but indispensable. They were the threads that held Persia's robe together. An unresolved thought. If the Persian Empire was the loom, were its couriers the threads? Or were they the invisible hands, pulling the world quietly into order? And if no one remembers the postman, does that mean he succeeded? The hooves continue. You don't hear them, not directly, only in the quiet rhythm of history. Another rider approaches, hands off his dispatch, and vanishes into the dust. Somewhere between the snow of Armenia and the heat of Susa, a message moves forward. In this section, we explore the infrastructure behind the Achaemenid postal system. Not merely the roads, but the management, the regulation, the challenges, and the people who held it all together, silently. The Achaemenid view of distance. To most ancient kingdoms, distance was an obstacle. To Persia, it was an opportunity. Darius the Great, in his inscriptions at Behistun, boasts, "What has been ordered by me night and day, that was done." But such command requires reach. The Angarium was not an afterthought. It was state strategy. The road, the rider, the station, they were tools of rule, as vital as a spear or a seal. Messages had to move. Delays were dangerous. Mountains, deserts, and deadlines. The royal road wasn't uniform. It cut through. Mountains Zagros Range, deserts central Iran, forest, river plains, urban centers and barren outposts. Each terrain required adaptation. In mountains, more rest stations, additional horses. In deserts, water stores and shade shelters. In river zones, ferries or boat crossings with logs kept. A clay docket from Susa reads, "Boat delayed at Tigris, rider waited, message sent with duplicate." A duplicate in 500 BCE. They anticipated failure and planned for it. Horse logistics, feeding the network. An ancient postal system is only as strong as its horses. Each station maintained 4 to 6 horses, rotated based on fatigue and season. Grooms were employed to feed, water, brush, monitor hooves. Feed logs were standard. Barley dry and crushed. Alfalfa when available. Water stored in ceramic vats. One administrative note from Ecbatana includes 2 horses limping, 3rd reassigned, vet summoned from Station 18. Even animal health was bureaucratized. These were not just animals, they were infrastructure. Station staff, invisible and essential. Each post station had a station master, often a mid-level royal appointee. Duties included logging incoming and outgoing messages, inspecting seals, reporting suspicious activity, managing supplies. Assistants helped track inventory and prep horses. Cooks, guards, and scribes also rotated through larger stations. They did not fight, they did not travel. They waited. They kept the path alive while the riders moved. Without them, the message would die in transit. Secrecy and the security of scrolls. Imperial dispatches were sacred. Breaking a seal without authorization was a capital offense. Messages could be military reports, intelligence summaries, economic records, religious permissions, orders to governors or satraps. To preserve secrecy, some scrolls were wrapped in protective cloth. Important messages were carried in metal tubes. Most were double-sealed with cylinder seals, unique to each sender. If a seal was broken, the receiver was instructed to report immediately. Station logs tracked the condition of the seals with a system of simple marks like modern sign-offs. Speed benchmarks and route maps. To maintain efficiency, speed reports were compiled. Average relay time between stations. Average delivery time for each region. Notes on rider fatigue, horse health, and weather. These reports were returned to Persepolis or Susa, where senior officials monitored postal performance. One preserved fragment reads, "Rider 14 delayed, mudslide on Hill Pass, 2 hours lost." 2 hours in a month-long route. This was a culture of punctuality, not romance. Even the most remote post station was accountable. Training the riders. Though we don't have a training manual, evidence suggests a structured apprenticeship system. Boys from nearby villages were brought to stations. They learned routes, horse care, message protocols. They served as stable assistants before being assigned real dispatch duty. One inscription mentions, Tarbes, now promoted to rider, took first message to Sidakin. His name appears only once, but someone remembered to log it. The messages themselves. Only a handful of Persian postal messages survive, but we can infer much from parallel archives at Persepolis and Babylon. Examples include tax receipts, Levi's from Bactria arrived late, authorized extension. Military orders, mobilize 2 regiments to Sardis, pass through Ecbatana. Resource audits, oil count in Carmania station lower than reported. Court summons, governor summoned to Susa, present with full accounts. Even disputes were managed via post. Satrap of Lydia complains of grain shipment delay. Investigate Station 24. In every case, the system functioned not to inspire, but to enable governance. Road maintenance and upkeep. The postal roads required constant maintenance. Clearing debris. Reinforcing bridges. Repainting way markers. Replacing milestone stones, some inscribed with Darius's name. Each province was responsible for its segment. Failure to maintain could result in sanctions or replacement of officials. A damaged road was not just an inconvenience, it was a political liability. Because every missed message could become a missed rebellion. Beyond Persia, legacy and influence. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia, he was astonished by the efficiency of its postal system. He kept it. Later, the Romans would adopt a similar system, the cursus publicus, and cite Persian influence. Even medieval Islamic dynasties reused the idea of relay riders and centralized post houses. In many cases, they borrowed Persian words for the offices and routes. The Angarium was not just a system. It was a template, an unresolved point. If the messages always arrived, but the riders were never named, who truly shaped the empire? Was it the king who issued the command? Or the boy who carried it across the mountains? You are still now, the dust has settled, the hoofbeats are gone, the stations stand quiet. Where once horses drank from clay basins and parchment passed between worn hands, there is only wind and sand. The Persian Empire is falling. And with it, the greatest courier system the world had ever seen begins to unwind, not with a crash, but with neglect. In this final section, we witness the disappearance of the Angarium and reflect on how something so massive, so efficient, so central to imperial life, could simply vanish. Alexander arrives. In 330 BCE, after a decade of war, Alexander the Great conquered the Achaemenid Empire. Darius III was dead. The satraps, the governors, the nobles replaced, exiled, or killed. But Alexander did something unusual. He kept the system. The royal road, the post stations, the riders all continued under Macedonian authority. Why? Because it worked. For several years, the Angarium adapted to new masters. Messages were now issued in Greek, but the methods remained Persian. Relay riders, sealed scrolls, station logs, route audits. Alexander needed the system to govern his sprawling, unfamiliar conquest. But after his death, the unraveling began. Fragmentation and forgotten routes. Alexander's empire did not last. His generals divided it into pieces. The Diadochi Wars broke out. Roads became borders. Stations fell out of use. No single authority could maintain the relay system, and without central control, the efficiency faltered. Station masters no longer received pay. Horses weren't rotated. Riders were drafted into military service. Local governors built private courier networks. A rider might arrive at a station and find no horse, no supplies, and no orders. The chain broke. Not in one place, but in hundreds all at once. The withering of a bureaucracy. Unlike monuments or temples, infrastructure decays invisibly. When a palace crumbles, we notice. When a post station goes unused, it simply turns to dust. There are no great tombs for station masters, no heroic laments for exhausted messengers. We know they existed because their routes were marked on maps. Their stations were excavated centuries later. Their dockets were copied into stone archives. Their absence caused gaps in governance. But the bureaucracy that once logged every hoofbeat, that counted parchment scrolls and sealed wax tubes, that knew exactly which horse was lame in Station 62. It died unarchived. What was lost? With the fall of the Angarium, Persia lost more than speed. It lost timely coordination of satrapies, rapid intelligence gathering, consistent tax reports, direct connection between king and subjects. Without the system, messages could take weeks longer to arrive. Rebellions flared, edicts were delayed, resources went unreported. And something more subtle happened. The empire's mind lost its voice. A body can still move without a nervous system, but it cannot react, cannot learn, cannot heal. Echoes in other empires. Though the Angarium died with Persia, its idea lived on. The Romans, Han Chinese, and Islamic caliphates each developed their own courier networks. The Cursus Publicus, the Yichuan Dao, the Barid, each shared Persian DNA. Centralized roads, relay riders, state oversight, message logs. Even the Ottoman Empire reused old Persian roadbeds. But none called their riders Angoroi. None remembered the original names. None preserved the archive. The system was reborn, but the people who ran it disappeared. Archaeology of a vanished network. What remains today? Traces of roadbeds in Iran, Turkey, Iraq. Broken pottery from way stations. Stone foundations in old desert outposts. Herodotus's words. Cylinder seals in museum drawers. One or two Persian phrases still used in Iranian mail systems. But there is no grand tablet that says, "Here ended the Angarium." Because the end of a network isn't an event. It's a non-arrival. A message that should have come but didn't. Modern resonance. Today, when we think of mail, of delivery, of logistics, we think in seconds. But the Persians thought in continuity. A message must arrive not fast but certainly. Reliability was the only virtue. And so their postmen rode. In blizzards. In sandstorms. Across bandit-ridden hills. With broken ribs. Without thanks. Not to innovate, not to conquer. But to keep one message moving, and then another, and another. Until the last one never left the station. An ending and a question. If the Angarium was never commemorated, but shaped empires for centuries, then what else in our world quiet, efficient, forgettable might be the thing that holds everything together? And if it disappeared, would we even notice? Until it was too late. You are lying now beneath ancient skis. The air is damp, heavy with the scent of marsh reeds and silt. Somewhere a canal overflows its banks. Somewhere a priest measures a flood level with a notched stick. Somewhere else a clerk records damage on a clay tablet in careful cuneiform. Welcome to Lagash. This is not a city of kings or conquests, but of temples and taxes, of levies and lists, of floods and food and forgiveness. And at its core, a system so mundane it would be overlooked if not for the thousands of tablets it left behind. Lagash was one of Sumer's oldest cities, and in it we find what may be the world's first example of disaster management, or, in today's words, flood insurance. A temple that owned everything. Lagash's greatest building was not a palace, it was the temple of Ningirsu, the city's patron god. Massive and imposing, it was more than a religious site. It was a landowner, a tax collector, an employer, a lender, a bureaucratic powerhouse. The temple controlled fields, herds, fisheries, and storehouses. Its records covered every transaction, every tax paid in barley or cattle, every offering burned or withheld. One clay tablet reads, 8 oxen borrowed by farmer Urrezin from Temple Field 7, repayment due after harvest, overseen by Lusig, priest scribe. Each line is silent now, but in its time it was the law. The Sumerian view of flooding. Floods were both blessing and curse. Without the annual water swell from the Tigris and Euphrates, fields would dry. But when the waters were too high or too early, they destroyed crops, homes, and granaries. Lagash, like its neighbors, learned to build canals and levees, but water had a will of its own. The priests taught that floods were sent by gods, but the scribes knew they required recording. Over 1,500 recovered tablets from Lagash document. Levee repairs, field inundation reports, crop damage estimates, compensation schedules, deferred tax agreements. This was not charity. It was a system. When the water took too much, a sample tablet from Gursu, a city within the Lagash region, reads: Field 34 flooded in the 3rd month, yield destroyed, temple tax delayed, farmer owes 3 measures next cycle. In other words, the flood was real but the tax remained. Lagash's priests understood survival required flexibility, so they did something quietly radical. They created a policy of deferred obligations. If your land flooded and you could prove it through temple inspection, your dues were postponed, not forgiven. The temple wouldn't take your last sack of grain, but it would take the next one. The priests as actuaries. Temple scribes walked fields after floods. They noted water depth, crop type, stage of growth at time of inundation, proximity to canal breaches. From this, they calculated acceptable loss and expected recovery. One tablet reads: Millet field of Enlilmesh, 60% loss. Estimate 240 liters. Temple to collect 96 liters next season. These were actuarial tables. Before spreadsheets, before decimals. And they worked. Because people trusted the process, even if they grumbled about the priests. Storing surplus for the storm. Lagash's temple system operated on granary logic. In good years, it taxed heavily, building reserves. In bad years, it loaned grain from those same stores. Loans were recorded. Amount borrowed. Purpose: flood loss, marriage, livestock illness. Interest: often 20-33%. Repayment window. A classic entry. To a Pulnana fisherman, 30 liters barley lent, flooded storage lost, repayment due after next catch, witnessed by Shuba netminder. Failure to repay wasn't imprisonment, it was social obligation. The next time a Pulnana caught a large fish haul, he brought grain back to the temple, because if he didn't, he wouldn't get help again. Floods and the price of justice. Flood years changed everything. Rations decreased. Grain prices soared. Labor contracts were rewritten. Fines were temporarily suspended. Interest rates adjusted downward. One letter between 2 temple officials states: The barley price is now 3 times standard. Pause collections from flood zone 7. Resume at new rate after equinox. This was data-driven empathy. It wasn't perfect, but it was measured. Lagash didn't prevent floods. It planned for them. Who received flood relief? Interestingly, flood compensation wasn't only for farmers. Temple employees, priests, potters, builders, and scribes also received flood-adjusted rations. 1 ration tablet. Standard share, 5 liters barley. Flood year adjustment, 3.5 liters. Note: due to crop loss from high water. Even the gods were accounted for. Offerings were reduced but never stopped. One priest recorded: Usual daily flour for Ningursu, 12 handfuls. This month, 8 until reserves restored. The gods, too, accepted austerity. Or at least their managers did. Ensuring livestock and labor. Floods didn't just destroy grain. They killed animals, washed away tools, and displaced laborers. Records show compensation for lost oxen, redistribution of plowing animals, reassignment of temple labor crews. A notable entry: Ox of Ishbaera drowned in flood. Temple provides replacement on credit, to be repaid via plowing contract over 2 months. This was resource insurance, but it also created debt cycles. Some workers spent years repaying the temple not because they were lazy, but because the water had taken too much. Still, the system kept people alive. And that mattered. An administrative act of faith. To a modern eye, it may seem exploitative, but to the people of Lagash, the temple's bureaucracy was the safety net. There were no private banks, no government subsidies, no cash. There was only the harvest, the flood, and the tablet that decided if you survived the winter. One inscription on a broken receipt reads, "Let it be recorded, the temple gives before it takes. May the field return next year." It's unclear if that was policy or hope. Maybe both. An unresolved thought. If the gods were the cause of the floods, but the temple handled the recovery, then who really shaped life in Lagash? Was salvation divine? Or simply well documented? The canal is quiet now. The fields are mostly dry, but the scribes are still busy. Clay tablets line the temple walls stacked like bricks, each one etched with symbols: crop yields, tax shares, rations, livestock tallies, loan interest. In this section, we go deeper into the bureaucratic web of Lagash's temple economy, how flood response wasn't just about recovery, but about maintaining trust, managing records, and preserving power. What emerged in Lagash was more than relief. It was early state governance, powered by mud, river water, and sharp reeds. The temple as landlord. By the early dynastic III period, c. 2500 BCE, Lagash had codified a system where the temple owned the land, and most farmers were tenants. Their leases were not indefinite, they were reevaluated annually, dependent on performance, tied to weather and water cycles. If floods destroyed a farmer's crop 2 years in a row, the temple might assign him a different plot, reduce his obligations, or in some cases, revoke the land entirely. Tablets show that land redistribution was regular, not punitive. One document reads, Field 42, reclaimed by temple, tenant assigned to new plot in flood-protected zone, witnessed by 3. This was not just charity, it was land management with climate awareness. Flood zone designations. By the reign of Enmetina, ruler of Lagash around 2400 BCE, the city began classifying land based on flood risk. These included fields near upper canal mouth, high risk; marsh border fields, medium risk, good for barley; temple core lands, low risk, used for reserves. Farmers in high-risk zones paid less tax, but also received fewer temple privileges. It was an ancient version of zoning. Some fields even had rotating duty. Dry year planted. Wet year left fallow or used for fish pond leasing. One receipt reads, Farmer Ebiham assigned field 18 for pond fishing, tax paid in fish, crop suspended due to flood. In Lagash, flooding wasn't always a curse, it was a variable to be negotiated. Legal instruments for a watery world. The temple developed a language of loopholes. Deferred grain due to divine water. Oxen replacement pending repayment. Levy breach clause enacted. Many tablets carry a line at the end. Should the waters rise again, agreement rolls forward. Floods were written into law, and scribes were essential to enforce it. In some cases, farmers sued each other or the temple over flood damage caused by negligence. One trial text. Eshnunna claims neighbor failed to clear canal silt, water overflowed, field lost, priest mediator to visit and judge. There were no juries, but there were inspections, witnesses, logs. Justice moved slowly, but it moved. The flood and the poor. Not everyone had land. Laborers, those who dug ditches, cleaned canals, or hauled barley, had no fields to lose, but floods still disrupted their work. In flood years, the temple offered relief rations: 2 liters barley day for canal crews, bonus rations for levee restorers, extra oil for reed harvesters. One particularly detailed account: during month of floods, 43 men received barley, 12 received oil, all temple workers. If you showed up, you ate. The temple became an employer of last resort, what some historians call an early welfare system. But it wasn't unconditional. Work was still required. Tablets show names struck off the ration list for non-attendance. Flooding made survival hard. The temple made it bureaucratic. Women and the flood economy. Women played a notable role in temple economic life. They wove textiles, ground grain, brewed beer, especially from flood-stored grain, managed food distribution during relief periods. In years of flooding, beer quotas were reduced to preserve barley, but women workers still received partial shares. One log. Shag brewer, 6 batches of flood beer prepared for ration stations, allowed half-grain measure as bonus. Beer was not luxury. It was hydration and calories essential during flood shortages. Women were often assigned to prepare emergency food for displaced families. The scribes recorded it all. Temple loans and flood cycles. We know the temple loaned grain, but it also loaned oxen, seed, tools, fishing nets, even laborers, all with attached interest. Flooded fields delayed repayment, but loans were never forgotten. One notorious clause: if borrower cannot repay within 2 cycles, temple may seize yield of next 2 plantings. It wasn't brutal, but it was thorough. Repeated floods meant multi-year debt spirals, and yet most people remained part of the system. Why? Because no one else offered help. Temple loans were both risk mitigation and social glue, symbolism and spiritual justification. Relief wasn't just economics, it was ritual. When a flood year began, the priests performed ceremonies: appeasing Enki, god of water and wisdom; reading omens from silt deposits; sacrificing goats at canal mouths. If flood damage was severe, the temple issued declarations of divine testing, often recorded in tablet preambles. Example: this is the season of Enki's abundance and trial. The grain is his, the flood is his, the records are ours. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was faith wrapped in numbers. Religion offered meaning, bureaucracy offered food and fairness. Both were needed to survive. Canal maintenance and public works. One of the most fascinating parts of Lagash's tablet archives is the extensive attention to infrastructure. Canal dredging logs, levee inspections, mud brick orders for repairs, laborer rosters for flood defense teams. Flood season wasn't just endured, it was prepared for. One year, anticipating a high flood, the temple issued an edict: close secondary canals, reinforce gate at Tummel Bend, all oxen reserved for levee duty. The scribes tracked every brick used in levee repair, every crew hour, every overseer's signature. It was the slow, dusty, daily miracle of ancient disaster prevention. An unfinished loophole. But what happened when temple debts grew faster than harvests? When floods lasted 2 or 3 years, or when the scribes themselves had no more grain to lend? What if the insurance system broke? And what would it take for a ruler to declare that all debts were erased? You are back at the temple. The scribes are weary, the grain bins are low, the water has not receded as expected, flood lines creep higher up the levee walls, the sky remains overcast. For the 3rd year in a row, harvests fail. The clay tablets pile up names, debts, fields lost, oxen drowned, promises broken. And then something extraordinary. A ruler does the unthinkable. He reaches into the archives, lifts the weight of mud and ink, and says, "Let all debts be cleared." In this final section, we examine the moment Lagash's meticulous, measured temple economy hit its limit, and how the solution was not a new tax, but forgiveness. A concept not born of mercy, but of survival. When the numbers no longer worked, Sumerian scribes were famously methodical. They recorded how much grain was stored, who borrowed how much, when it was due, the interest rate, the projected return. But during extended flood periods, that math began to crumble. A pattern emerges across dozens of tablets. Second-year delay recorded. Loan extension granted. Yield insufficient to meet repayment. Interest compounding. Oxen collateral transferred. And then, in some clay tablets found shattered and left unrepaired, we see abrupt terminations of accounts. Why? Because the system was drowning. Ugarit's revolution, c. 2350 BCE. Lagash's most radical moment came under Ugarit, a reformist ruler who came to power amid growing economic strain and civil dissatisfaction. In a famous decree known from surviving inscriptions, he issued what might be the first recorded proclamation of debt amnesty. His order included the cancellation of all debts owed to the temple, the return of seized lands to tenant farmers, the reduction of temple fees for essential services, the prohibition of temple officials exploiting orphans and widows, a ban on the seizure of tools or animals for debt repayment. This was not benevolence. It was reset. The flood insurance system had become the burden. What the tablets say. On one relief fragment from Gersu, a scribe wrote, "No longer shall the temple take the plow of the poor man. No longer shall the scribe take grain from the widow's jar." This was revolutionary. It did not erase the temple's authority, but it restructured its role. The economy, so tightly woven around flooding cycles, had reached a point where bureaucracy choked the very survival it once protected. Ugarit's response was to restore balance by reducing pressure from the top. The Year of Freedom. This concept, called in Sumerian Amagi, letter 120 BC letter 12104, roughly translates to return to the mother, or freedom through restoration. It became the name of the year. The Year of Freedom. The year debts were forgiven. The year justice was rebalanced. Scribes began recalibrating ledgers. Old debts were marked with closed by decree. Oxen were returned to farmers. Tenants reclaimed lands. Workers removed from temple labor rosters. This was not universal or permanent. But it bought time, it restored hope. And it reminded Lagash that bureaucracy must bend to the flood, not drown in it. After the reforms, Ugarit's changes were not eternal. Within a generation, new rulers reinstated many old practices. Taxes resumed. Interest returned. Temple land expanded again. But something had shifted. The idea of forgiveness amagi became a recurring concept in Mesopotamian governance. Later rulers in neighboring city-states adopted similar policies. Babylonian kings issued edicts of release. Assyrian governors pardoned debts after famines. Even in Hammurabi's code, some relief measures appear for disaster-struck citizens. Lagash may not have invented mercy, but it formalized it. In clay, lessons from the silt. What did Lagash teach us? That flood insurance isn't just about money, it's about trust in institutions, adaptability of systems, the importance of accurate record-keeping, the human need for relief when nature overwhelms law. The temple didn't stop the river. It documented its damage. It assigned value to mud and misery. And when it couldn't balance the books, it chose to erase them just long enough to start over. Echoes in modern policy. Today we have FEMA disaster relief, flood zone maps, crop insurance, deferred tax payments after hurricanes. But the core idea is the same. How do we help people survive the thing we knew might happen? Lagash asked that question 4,000 years ago. With styluses, with temples, with clay. And now a final thought. If clay tablets can capture a flood, and temple rules can be rewritten by water's will, then what other quiet systems, insurance, pensions, rations, credit are merely waiting for their next flood? And who will lift the stylus to write their freedom? You find yourself beneath the relentless sun. The horizon ripples in the heat. The sand stretches endlessly in all directions, but somewhere far, far out in the shimmering dust there is movement. A low moan of wind and the soft plod of leather-padded hooves signal the approach of something remarkable. A camel caravan, moving slowly but surely across the Sahara. It is the 11th century CE. Welcome to Tagheza, Timbuktu, and the salt roads of the Trans-Saharan trade, a world built not on gold or silk or spice, but on salt blocks, carried across thousands of miles on the backs of animals that did not exist in this region just a few centuries before. This is not the story of empires or kings, though they appear briefly on the dusty edge. This is the story of logbooks, caravan customs, water taxes, and the ordinary men who kept the trade alive in the harshest place on earth. The salt that walked. It may seem hard to imagine now, but in the Sahel and Savannah regions of medieval West Africa, salt was not a seasoning, it was currency, preserver, and medicine. People sweated out their salt in the heat. Without replacement, muscles failed, nerves spasmed, life dimmed. Salt came from only a few desolate places in the Sahara. Tagheza, a sun-bleached settlement in present-day Mali, where salt was mined in slabs and stacked like bricks. Ijel, another major deposit, located in what is now Mauritania. Bilma, in the east, a salt oasis connected to Kanem Bornu and Lake Chad. Each of these centers produced salt that was then loaded onto camel caravans, hundreds, sometimes thousands of camels bound for the south. They didn't travel alone. The men who walked beside camels. A camel can carry 250–300 pounds of goods, but it cannot read the stars, repair a harness, negotiate a bribe at a caravanserai, memorize watering points. That's where the Azali came in. These were the salt caravanners, mostly men from desert communities like the Tuareg, Sanhaja, or Songhai. They walked beside the camels for weeks, sometimes months. They memorized the sequence of oases, the position of rock outcrops, and the subtle signs of shifting dunes. Their tools: wooden staffs, woven robes for sun and sand, leather water bags, oral contracts. Every caravan had at least one tax scribe and one religious leader, because faith and finance were inseparable in this world. Salt taxation and caravan tolls. You might imagine these traders wandering freely across an empty desert, but in truth, the Sahara was a web of invisible borders, each guarded by someone collecting a fee. At every major stop like Walata, Aryayuane, or Timbuktu, the caravan faced transit taxes on salt weight, licensing fees to enter market zones, protection payments to local chiefs or militias, water tariffs at strategic wells. Some cities charged based on the number of camels. One surviving report from Arab geographer al-Bakri mentions, at Walata, a fee of 2 dinars per 10 camels is collected. The scribe notes each animal by its color and mark. Every scribe carried a wooden tablet or scroll to tally taxes, and some even used colored cords knotted in specific ways to mark payment types. It was not a written economy everywhere, but it was recorded. Oases as government offices. Oases were not just water points. They were tax stations, storage facilities, and sometimes courts of arbitration. A caravan might stop at Eryayuin, where salt slabs were weighed on stone platforms. A local scribe recorded the tax paid in gold dust or cowries. Disputes were settled over lost camels or broken contracts. Witnesses were summoned, often elders or Islamic scholars. Salt was measured by the quintar, about 100 pounds or the slab, and recorded with carved marks on the slabs themselves. Some slabs still bear these marks today, faint and scratched, but real. The silent language of salt slabs. Salt slabs were more than product, they were invoices. A typical slab might have a caravan mark, brand or cut notch, a destination stamp to identify the buyer in Timbuktu or beyond, a tax tally, simple symbols to show if fees were paid. If a caravan dodged a toll station, the slab would lack the mark and could be refused by merchants further south. In other words, salt moved through a regulated system, even across hundreds of miles of drifting sand. Camels as currency. A healthy camel could be worth more than gold. It drank little, survived extremes, and was unlike oxen well adapted to the terrain. Records from 12th century Timbuktu suggest one camel could fetch 25-30 gold dinars. Losing a camel meant renegotiating delivery terms. Sick camels could be sold as meat at desert stops. Every caravan had a camel book, a memory list sometimes written, often recited of each beast. Owner, load weight, color, lineage. Some camel herders traced ancestry for breeding rights. A corrupt toll agent might seize camels instead of accepting coin. One account from a trader states, "We offered 5 slabs of salt, but he took the brown camel with the bent left ear. It was worth more." Bureaucracy was flexible but never free. How the salt roads shaped cities. Timbuktu, Gao, and Janneh didn't rise by accident. They grew where the salt trade intersected with gold fields of the south, manuscript copying centers, markets for kola nuts, ivory, and textiles. But behind these shining cities was a boring core. Tax registries, toll ledgers, market zone permissions, water rationing schedules, salt-to-gold exchange rates. Slabs entered Timbuktu's walls weighed and taxed. From there, they were broken down, sold, and often traded in fragments smaller than your hand, for food, textiles, or writing paper. A silent question in the sand. If the salt slab bears no mark, if the camel does not appear in the tally, if the fee was paid in water instead of coin, did the tax exist? And who remembers the debt when the desert buries the evidence? The caravan moves again. The sun has not changed. The sand is the same. But the ledgers, the marks, the murmured prayers, they form a quiet network beneath the hooves of every camel. This section dives deeper into the day-to-day function of Sahara's salt routes, not the drama of empires or the romance of desert trade, but the small systems, human rhythms, and painstaking logistics that turned the world's largest desert into an accounting office without walls. Oases, the quiet heart of the desert economy. While the camel trails covered thousands of kilometers, the oases anchored the system. They weren't just refueling points, they were record stations, trust zones, legal courts, postal depots, supply markets, temporary homes. Each oasis had a headman or sheikh, sometimes elected, sometimes appointed by nearby political authorities like the Mali Empire or Songhai. Their tasks included certifying tax collection, registering caravan arrivals, mediating disputes, keeping grain stockpiles for emergencies, regulating access to water. In oases like Etched and Aryayuan, written documents were rare, but contracts were memorized by appointed rememberers, a class of oral accountants. A salt slab might travel 800 km, but its ownership trail was stored in mines, not ink. The invisible ledgers, oral accounting and memory guilds. How do you run a bureaucracy in a world where writing is rare and paper disintegrates in the heat? The answer: with people. In several Saharan communities, there existed a tradition of oral record-keeping, with roles passed hereditarily. These memory men, and sometimes women, had defined vocabularies for weights, payments, debts, mnemonic songs to track transaction sequences, ritualized witnessing procedures, 3 elders equals binding contract, coded greetings that revealed trade status and clan standing. One observer wrote, "They sang the dead in verses, 1 line per owner, each camel marked by a rhythm." In some regions, knotted cords similar to Inca quipu were used to assist in tallying items. A red knot equals salt. A blue knot equals water debt. A long knot equals camel load. 3 short knots equals days until next tax. The system worked until disrupted by external interference or drought. Water as currency. Salt was wealth, but water was life. Caravans paid not in coins but in salt slabs, strips of leather, dried meat, favorable contracts, wells along the desert dug and maintained by local clans charged per bucket or skin. In some cases, first draw of water was free. Second was tax per camel. Third required barter or service. Well keepers were respected and feared. A caravan that disrespected a well could find itself denied access on its return journey. This gave rise to water diplomacy. Advance riders who negotiated ahead of the caravan. Gifts sent ahead to maintain relationships. Water debt tablets, rudimentary IOUs carved into wood or bone. One surviving tablet reads, 4 skins of water owed by the caravan of Azaj, to be paid at the rise of Sirius. The date refers to an astronomical marker used to signal return time. Salt slabs as bureaucratic objects. While we think of salt slabs as trade items, to the caravanners and oasis keepers, they were legal units, measurement standards, identity markers. Each slab weighed roughly 25–30 kg and was shaped to match local specifications. Slabs from Taghaza were rectangular, light gray, slightly brittle. Slabs from Ijel were thicker, cream-colored, more durable. Timbuktu scribes often noted salt by origin. 4 slabs Taghaza cut marked. 2 Ijel slabs, unstamped disputed source. Disputes over salt origin could void an entire trade. This is why some caravans carried their own seal stones to mark slabs with personal or clan symbols, often pressed into the salt before stacking. Caravan protocol, the bureaucracy of movement. Caravans operated like small governments on the move. They had a lead merchant Ammon, a scribe, a route master, religious authorities, imam or qa macron letter 10 di macron, animal handlers, scouts, porters, security guards. Before departure, the group created a roster of camels, a manifest of goods, a prayer of protection, an oath of conduct, sometimes spoken aloud before elders. The caravan would leave at night or dawn, traveling by star navigation, shadow length, hot wind patterns. Distances were measured in marches, not kilometers. 1 march equals distance traveled between known water sources. What happens when a caravan disappears? Sometimes they didn't make it. Dunes shifted, wells dried, raiders attacked, camels collapsed. And then nothing. When a caravan failed to appear, the salt slabs were listed as missing in market books. Oases down the line were notified by passing merchants. A reconciliation tax was imposed to adjust supply-demand ratios. Families gathered to mourn but sometimes refused to do so for a year. Hopping the caravan had simply taken a new route. In exceptional cases, ghost caravans were remembered in song stories of men seen in the mirage, never returning. Salt might melt in rain, camels might die. But ledgers waited just in case. A quiet repetition, year after year. What made this system work was not grandeur but repetition. Every year the salt moved. From mines to oasis. From oasis to market. From market to village. From village to food, sweat, healing. Each leg of the journey was marked. With fees. With prayers. With slabs. With names spoken into desert air. And even if a scribe wrote nothing down, someone remembered. But what if the salt no longer comes? What happens when the well is dry? The camel herders migrate. The tax scribe forgets the rhythm. And the oasis headman no longer knows who owes what. If the desert erases the memory, is the economy gone? Or does it lie beneath the sand, waiting for a new caravan to pass? You return again to the desert. But this time, something is different. The wind is no longer trailing behind a column of camels. The well is silent. The flat white slabs of salt still sit at the edge of the oasis, but there are no scribes, no ropes, no traders measuring them by sun length. The Sahara is still here, but the system has vanished. In this final section, we explore how the trans-Saharan salt economy unraveled not with conquest or fire, but through slow erosion, of relationships, of logistics, of memory. A story not of collapse but of gradual forgetting. Disruption by the sea. For centuries, the salt roads defined power in West Africa. But in the 15th century, a new path opened: European maritime trade. Portuguese ships, sailing down the Atlantic coast, reached the Senegal River. They bypassed the desert routes entirely, offering cheaper salt from sea evaporation, manufactured goods, firearms, gold trade without middlemen. Suddenly, the oases of Aryayuan, the ledgers of Walata, the taxes of Timbuktu all faced competition. It was not immediate. Salt caravans still moved, but volumes shrank. Fewer scribes were needed. Memory keepers lost clients. And most importantly, coastal powers rose. Urban decline and broken trust chains. Cities like Gao and Walata depended not only on trade, but on reliability. Once the maritime route offered faster gold access, kingdoms realigned. Tuareg traders turned to raiding. Sahel rulers shifted focus from the desert to the coast. Literacy faded in some oases as scribes left for port cities. Caravan sizes dropped from hundreds to dozens of camels. By the 18th century, Azalai caravans were smaller, less organized, and more ceremonial than economic. Some surviving salt ledgers show wide gaps between entries. A page in 1722. The next not until 1739. Then none after 1751. Each missing mark is not just silence. It's a broken link in a chain of trust that once spanned 1,000 kilometers. Salt slabs left behind. In Tagheza and Ijel, excavations have found entire stacks of salt slabs buried under sand. Why weren't they moved? Possibilities. The caravan never arrived. Ownership was disputed. The buyer no longer existed. Water at the next oasis failed. Some slabs have faint brands still visible, identifying forgotten traders from centuries past. Others were recycled locally, broken into chunks to be used in tanning hides, treating meat, curing fish, ironically, fish brought in from the new Atlantic trade. The salt remained useful, but the system no longer did. The final scribes. As literacy dwindled in desert settlements, the last scribes adapted. In Timbuktu, Ahmed Baba, a 16th century scholar, wrote of economic record-keeping and Islamic jurisprudence related to caravan contracts. His works attempted to preserve the bureaucratic logic of the trade routes. But even he saw the decline. In one letter to a colleague he wrote, "The men now care more for the sea winds than for the camel's path." By the 19th century, most tax stations were gone. Caravanserais collapsed. Oases like Etched became ghost towns. The salt still came, but fewer and fewer people kept count. Echoes in today's trade routes. The story of the Sahara salt roads is not just a medieval curiosity. It reveals enduring truths about fragile bureaucracies, trust-based economies, geographic bottlenecks, the vulnerability of oral systems. Today, our digital supply chains rely on data centers, satellites, port customs software, barcode scanners. But if the network breaks, if memory is lost, if no one checks the ledger, do we not face the same silence that fell over Aryayuan? The Sahara teaches us this. Even salt can disappear when no one remembers where it was meant to go. The modern Azalai. Even now, in Niger and Mali, Azalai caravans still depart from Bilma and head toward Agadez. Some do it for trade, others for tradition. The camels are fewer, the slabs smaller, the profits slimmer. But the rhythm remains. The man with the staff, the wind in the dunes, the small mark on the slab, the remembered route. A ghost of bureaucracy still walks the sand. Final reflection, what was buried under the sand? The salt was never the most valuable thing. It was the network, the men who remembered the deals, the oases that gave water and judgment, the slabs marked with silent agreement, the trust that crossed borders without ink. When that network faded, the desert did not care. It simply swallowed the ledgers whole. And now we ask, if our networks falter, if the scribes forget, and the slabs go unmarked, will we know how to begin again?